Let's revert back now to our top story, the Ukraine crisis, and I'm delighted to welcome Fiona Hill on the show. She was an intelligence officer on Russia and Eurasian affairs for Presidents Bush and Obama. She also served on the National Security Council under President Trump. She's now a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thanks.
On set with me is France 24's international affairs commentator Douglas Herbert. Doug spent years reporting in Russia and has been following the crisis closely for us.
Evening.
First, I want to ask you, Fiona, a nursery school was shelled near Luhansk today. How dangerous is the situation right now?
Well, we're in a constant state of danger, so we have to be very vigilant for all these kinds of events. We've been very concerned, and I say this as analysts and the United States government and many others, obviously watching from France, that there might be some kind of pretext for the outbreak of a conflict and then a potential Russian invasion. If we look back to 2008, when Russia went into Georgia. And of course, then President Sarkozy had to play a very important role in trying to intervene then after a Russian invasion. It also started off with something like this shelling coming from the separatist area of South Ossetia over into the rest of Georgia, return of fire by the Georgians. And then next thing, we had the invasion of the Russians into Georgia, coming from Russian territory. So we have to be extraordinarily careful whenever there is an incident like this to be very sure what's happening, getting full information, and to make sure that it's not then the precursor for a Russian military movement. We've also had the Russian parliament make a resolution and have hearings on the prospect of recognizing the two breakaway regions in the Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk, and also all kinds of other legislative maneuverings that would facilitate, at least from the Russian perspective, Russian forces moving in support and to protect, as they would say, of Russian speakers in those regions.
Fiona Hill, Doug Herbert here. Russia said this Thursday in a written letter to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow that it was not planning to invade Ukraine, but it did warn that it would take, and I'm quoting here, military technical measures if the West did not meet its demands to pull back the NATO presence in Eastern Europe. Could you help us decipher that? What does it mean by military technical measures?
Well, that can mean all kinds of things. I mean, we've already seen a pretty large cyber attack against Ukraine, one of the denial of services attacks. Of course, Ukraine's been suffering from those from Russia for quite some time now. We've already seen covert action. You were talking in the last segment about the use of the Wagner paramilitary military forces that Russia has deployed in Africa and Sahel and other regions, for example. They've also used the Wagner group in Syria, and we've had reports at various points of paramilitary forces being moved towards the Donbass. They used forces without any epaulets, without any insignia in Crimea when they annexed Crimea. So there's those kinds of actions that we could also envisage. And we also might see what they might call an intervention by peacekeeping forces or a humanitarian intervention in light of some pretext of an attack on civilian population or on rebel forces in Donbass. There's all kinds of things that can mean. If we're fixated on the idea of full large-scale invasion, Putin has given himself and the Russians have given themselves a whole array of options that they can basically dip into. It doesn't have to be, what we might see as a sort of a set-piece invasion of troops going across tanks and artillery and air force or, landing vessels from the Black Sea coast. As they've said, they've given themselves all kinds of things that could fall under the rubric of military technical response.
You wrote yourself recently in a guest essay in the New York Times, Putin can act as he chooses, when he chooses. Who can stop him from acting, and when might he act?
Well, what he wants to have right now is operational surprise. I mean, we've already passed a deadline of yesterday, February 16th, when there was an anticipation that he might do something. And clearly, he doesn't want to do something as if it looks, completely predictable. So he's looking for, again, that element of operational surprise when he can catch us off guard. What he's trying to do, we have to bear in mind, is to get a grip on Ukraine. So he can also do this by squeezing the Ukrainian economy, which is actually doing right now. This threat of war, this offensive posture, these exercises are for an invasion. They're not defensive exercises, just to be very clear. So he's already doing something in the military technical sphere that's causing alarm. That's causing us to redeploy our own personnel in embassies and elsewhere. You're seeing capital flight from Ukraine. He very much hopes that he can crush the Ukrainian economy in this way. So again, he can choose many different things. What we have to do is to be able to push back across the board. We have to have France and Germany, the United States, all of the major allies in lockstep, in close coordination as we have right now. And we have to be basically on alert. Unfortunately, this is probably going to be for quite some period of time, and we have to be very consistent in our messaging and also be coordinating behind the scenes about the various responses that we are going to take when Putin and the Russians undertake certain kinds of action.
And we've seen a parade of diplomats and even world leaders sort of paying court to Vladimir Putin at the Kremlin in the past week or so. And they all sort of come back empty-handed or near empty-handed. What's your sense? Can anyone get through to Vladimir Putin? Is there a Putin whisperer? Is there someone he listens to, someone who could maybe budge his worldview, which seems pretty congealed at this point?
Well, he's got a lot of people around him, and that's the real question is what information are they giving him? He's got a lot of the hard guys of Russian security services who actually want to see a complete blow up with the West. They want to pull Russia away from all of its entanglements, financial, economic, political, and otherwise, and create a kind of autarky. So they would be very much pushing him in one direction. He does meet with an array of people. We see some of these as sort of shows of recent meeting with Foreign Minister Lavrov. He's got his intelligence services. We don't really know what they're telling him at the moment, but he will get some signals very clearly if certain things do happen. I mean, you said that European leaders are paying court. I mean, that's the way he spins it. But they're also passing on messages to him. We saw President Macron passing messages on publicly. We presume things have been said to him privately as well. If he starts to get signals from others outside of Europe, people he doesn't anticipate, other countries, for example, that pass on private messages. If he gets members of business communities saying, well, look, hey, we're going to pull back on investment, not just in Ukraine, but also in Russia, because things are very unpredictable. There's a lot of things here that could be signals that go to him directly that might make him recalculate. So I say that, all is lost and the people have gone away empty-handed. He will be assessing based on the things that he hears from them about the limits of what he can do, and maybe then the full extent of things that he can do.
So this isn't really just about score settling with the United States. It's not just about the U.S. as the sole interlocutor of Russia. That you get the sense Vladimir Putin will pick up on messages or signals sent to him by Europeans. He will take the European messages seriously.
Absolutely, he will. I mean, when he basically says, I only want to talk to the United States, he's doing that to push Europe's buttons. He's trying to sow division. So the biggest thing that we have to do is to stick together and not to be easily insulted by him. He's playing games. I mean, he knew fine, of course, that completely well that President Macron was hoping to have some different outcome because he's just ahead of a presidential election. So Putin, is denying him any kind of diplomatic success, but it doesn't mean to say that he wasn't paying attention to what he was saying. He knows that Chancellor Scholz of Germany is newly invested in that position. And that, there's some questions at home as well as abroad about what kind of Chancellor Scholz is going to be. He knows that, for example, when the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, Liz Truss, was just in Moscow, that she is also potentially a contender for the British Prime Minister position if Boris Johnson is removed by his party. And he didn't want to, basically give her any room for maneuver either. He is looking to either insult or to humiliate or manipulate leaders when they go to see him. So we have to be very careful about that. So again, we have to try to show solidarity and a unified position, and he'll be paying attention to that.
And Fiona, branching out from Ukraine and Russia, what effect has the situation in Ukraine already had on Ukraine's neighbours? I'm thinking about Moldova, etc.
Well, it's obviously had a pretty chilling effect. You're right to mention Moldova because, Moldova has been basically trying to strike a fine balance between relations with Europe and relations with Russia. And of course, they have Transnistria, the secessionist region that they're trying to find a resolution for. And if, of course, the Russians go ahead and recognize Donetsk and Luhansk, the Donbass separatist regions, that really increases the pressure on Moldova. Is that what's going to happen with Transnistria, for example? There's been a lot of anxiety, obviously, engendered in the Baltic states and Poland because of what's been happening in Belarus, not just in Ukraine, where all these exercises are taking place, and the risks that Belarus will now become an armed camp more than it has been before, will be permanently hosting Russian soldiers and potentially even nuclear-capable Iskander missiles. And Russia's also raised a lot of questions about Kaliningrad, its exclave that's sandwiched between Poland and the Baltic states. And again, raising suggestions that it might increase its deployments in Kaliningrad. So I would say that what Russia has done to Ukraine has completely put on edge all of the neighbours, including in Eastern Europe, not just in the former Soviet space, and further afield. Because what Russia has also done is challenge the US position in the Asia Pacific. It's putting pressure on Japan to make a choice between improved relations with Russia and continuing to host American bases in Japan. It's really kind of putting a lot of other countries on notice that Russia's intent here is to completely overturn the kinds of security arrangements and calculations that we've had for the last 30 years.
You just mentioned Asia Pacific there, Fiona. Should the West be worried about the growing friendship between Moscow and Beijing?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of us, myself included, have had some questions about how durable that will be given long-standing tensions between Russia and China. But what we see from the recent statement from President Xi and Putin on the margins of the Olympics in Beijing is really a bit of a game changer, because China has actually also criticized enlargement of NATO. It didn't say anything notably about the European Union, but China suddenly made itself part of these calculations and has signaled to the Russians that China is watching Russia's back, that Russia can redeploy forces from the Far East to the West, and clearly has made it evident that this partnership between Russia and China is more meaningful than it was before. So now Russia is also going to have to be part of calculations in the Asia Pacific. We can't just confine our thinking about Russia to the European arena. And, given your previous discussions as well about the role of Wagner Group, in Africa and North Africa, and, Russia's paramilitary forces that are in many different places, and Russia's interests in, basically global maritime positions. For example, we've seen, the Russians and naval exercises all over the place, the Mediterranean, the Pacific, as well as, the Atlantic, the Caribbean, for example, that Russia wants us to notice the fact that it is a global player. And so by bandwagoning and partnering with China, Russia is putting itself in a very different place than it might have been before.
All right, that's all we have time for, I'm afraid. Thank you so much, Fiona Hill, for your time and analysis. Thank you, Doug, for being with us.